The small lake behind my house used to be my little paradise, a place where I'd sit for hours, watching the gentle ripples feeding the fish and letting peace settle in my heart. But who could have imagined that same lake would almost become my grave? My daughter-in-law knew perfectly well that I couldn't swim. Yet she still shoved me hard, sending me crashing into the deepest part of the water. The moment I went under, the cold wrapped around me like death itself. If it weren't for my friends who happened to be nearby and jumped in just in time, I wouldn't be here calmly telling you this story today. So stay with me till the end of this video. I promise what you're about to hear will shake you. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening to my story from? Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, because this story is only the beginning. It was a calm autumn afternoon, the kind that made the air smell like ripe apples and fresh soil. The garden behind my house shimmered with golden sunflowers and pale blue hydrangeas, my little paradise that had sheltered 3 generations under its soft light. My granddaughter's 5th birthday was in full bloom, her laughter echoing between the trees. Crystal glasses, touched children's shoes ran over the grass. The strawberry cake looked too beautiful to eat. From my seat on the wooden bench near the pond, I smiled as she leaned over to blow out the candles, her tiny hands clasped together, her face full of wishes only a child could make. I should have felt happy, but a quiet fatigue sat in my chest. Just before the guests arrived, I had a silent disagreement with my daughter-in-law about the decorations. She insisted on bright balloons and glitter everywhere. I wanted something softer, more heartfelt, something that spoke of family instead of vanity. When I suggested keeping it simple, her smile froze. Later, she laughed loudly with the neighbors, pretending everything was fine, but her eyes avoided mine. I didn't want another argument. I told myself to stay calm, to let her have her way. It was my granddaughter's day, not a day for conflict. Still, something felt off. As I watched Brooklyn walk across the yard, her heels sinking slightly into the grass, I noticed her whispering to the waiter. Her fingers traced the rim of a glass too carefully, her smile too rehearsed. A faint chill brushed my neck. I tried to dismiss it as nerves. Perhaps I was overthinking again, as mothers often do, when they sense something they can't quite name. The guests cheered when the candles went out. My son lifted his daughter in his arms, and for a second, the world seemed whole. The golden light rippled across the pond, and I exhaled slowly, trying to convince myself that everything was all right. But deep down, a small voice whispered that peace this perfect never lasts. I ignored it, forcing another smile for the camera. If I had known that within minutes this cheerful garden would turn from laughter to horror, I would have stood up. I would have stopped the celebration. But I didn't. I stayed there smiling gently as the shadow of what was coming, quietly, settled over us. A scream sliced through the afternoon air so sharp it made my heart stop. Someone shouted that the little girl had fallen into the pond. It was Brooklyn's voice, shrill and trembling, just enough to sound believable. My head turned instinctively toward the sound, but before my eyes could find my granddaughter, a violent force hit me from behind. There was no time to think. My body lurched forward, my arms flailed helplessly, and the next thing I felt was the cold slap of water swallowing me whole. The world shattered into sound and silence all at once. The splash echoed, then faded into a muffled roar under the surface. My dress wrapped tightly around my legs, dragging me down. My lungs burned. The shock of the cold crushed my chest like a fist. I tried to kick to reach for light, but panic blurred everything. I had never learned to swim. Even as a child, I had feared deep water. And now that fear became real, merciless, inescapable. I pushed upward with trembling hands breaking the surface for just one desperate breath. Air rushed in, mixed with water and terror. Through the blur of my wet lashes, I saw Brooklyn on the edge of the pond, her face twisted in false horror. She screamed for help, shouting, "Save my daughter, Mom! Hurry!" The words cut like ice. She called me Mom, not with love but command, as if I were a servant in her play of innocence. Around us, people screamed, chairs clattered, but no one reached in. They all looked toward the child who wasn't even in danger while I struggled unseen, sinking again into the black water. My arms felt heavy, useless. My mind screamed for help, but my voice drowned in the chaos. I thought of my granddaughter's tiny hands holding the birthday candles just minutes ago, of the way she had smiled at me. I wanted to live to tell her again that her grandmother would always protect her. But the cold grew stronger, curling around my limbs like chains. The sunlight above rippled and then dimmed, replaced by the suffocating quiet of betrayal. The water around me turned dark and heavy, swallowing every sound I tried to make. From below, I could still see the shimmering lights above the surface, party lanterns and fairy bulbs flickering like thousands of tiny petals sinking with me. They looked almost beautiful, like a funeral dressed as a celebration. For years, I had believed in that beauty, in the polished image of a perfect family, built on smiles, dinners, and polite laughter. Now, as I drifted downward, I saw it for what it was, a fragile illusion floating above me, already breaking apart. My breath thinned, each inhale a struggle against the weight pressing on my chest. My heartbeat slowed, the pounding turning faint and distant. The world blurred into blue and gold streaks. Only one image remained clear, my granddaughter's face. I saw her in my mind as she ran into my arms every morning, her voice bright and sweet, calling Nana. That memory glowed warmer than the lights above the last flicker of life I could hold on to. The cold crept into my bones, but what truly froze me wasn't death. It was the truth that the hands pushing me into this silence belonged to the woman I had once trusted like my own daughter. I remembered the days we cooked together, the way she smiled while handing me a cup of tea, the way she said thank you when I gifted her this very house. Every moment replayed now with cruel clarity, revealing how carefully she had played her part. The betrayal cut deeper than the water could ever reach. Through the blur, I noticed shapes moving above shadows, bending distorted by the rippling surface. The guests were running toward the pond, their movements frantic. The water trembled with splashes, and shouts that sound sharp and distant, like knives slicing through the mask of false peace. I wanted to tell them not to believe her screams, not to believe her tears, but the words stayed trapped inside me, lost in the murk. As I sank a little lower, the music from the party echoed faintly through the water, soft, slow, cruelly serene. The laughter that once felt warm now sounded hollow, a ghost of the family I thought I had. I reached out one last time toward the fading light, not for air, but for truth. Even as everything dimmed, one thought stayed. Lies may shine brighter on the surface, but truth always waits beneath, patient and unyielding. Mr. Jones and Ms. Linda were the first to move. Without hesitation, they threw off their jackets and plunged into the cold pond. The water exploded around them as they fought the current, their arms slicing through the murk to find me. I drifted somewhere between darkness and light, barely aware of their voices calling my name. Then a pair of strong hands grabbed my arm. My body was pulled upward, the world spinning until air hit my face again. I coughed violently, water burning my throat as if my lungs were on fire. They dragged both me and my granddaughter to the shore, laying us on the damp grass. The ground felt strange beneath me, solid, yet spinning. My chest heaved, gasping for air. A stream of dirty pond water spilled from my mouth, followed by tears I didn't know were falling. Someone covered me with a towel. My body shook uncontrollably from the cold, but the chill inside came from something deeper. I turned my head trying to find my granddaughter. She was safe, wrapped in Linda's arms, coughing weakly, but breathing. Relief washed over me, fragile and painful. The garden, once full of laughter, had turned into chaos. Guests shouted to call an ambulance, children wailed, and the decorations fluttered uselessly in the wind. Through the noise, I saw Brooklyn standing near the pond, her hands pressed against her mouth, pretending to tremble. Her voice cracked as she muttered, "Oh my God." I didn't see her fall. But her eyes, those eyes avoided mine, cold, calculating, already spinning a story she could control. I wanted to speak to tell them what had happened, but my body wouldn't obey. My breath came in shallow gasps, and every word felt like it would tear my throat apart. Mr. Jones pressed my shoulder gently, telling me to stay still, that help was on the way. Then a shout pierced the noise. "Look! Something's floating near the edge." All heads turned toward the water. A plastic bag had surfaced, drifting slowly toward the shore. It snagged on a loose branch of hydrangea that had fallen during the struggle. The bag's edge shimmered under the fading light, something dark and heavy visible inside. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Whatever lay inside that bag didn't belong to a child's birthday. It belonged to the truth rising with me from the bottom of the water. When the bag was pulled from the water, a hush fell over the garden. The plastic tore open under trembling hands, and one by one its contents spilled onto the wet grass. A gold ring, a pair of pearl earrings, a sapphire necklace that gleamed faintly beneath the setting sun. It was the same jewelry I had reported missing just 2 hours earlier. The pieces lay there, glistening like cold witnesses, their beauty now stained by deceit. No one spoke at first. The music had stopped long ago, but the silence now felt heavier than any sound. I saw Brooklyn's face pale, her lips trembling as though she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Her hands clutched her dress tightly, knuckles, white eyes darting from the jewelry to the people staring at her. For a moment, she looked like a child caught stealing, stripped of every mask she had ever worn. I felt my throat ache as I forced out the words that had been pressing inside me. My voice came out cracked and weak, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "It turns out," I said between shallow breaths, "that what sank under the water wasn't just me. It was your true face, too." Gasps rippled through the guests. Someone's phone camera clicked, another began recording. The sound of shutters filled the tense air, sharp and relentless. Whispers followed almost instantly, fragmented phrases of disbelief, pity, and judgment. Did she push that jewelry was stolen? Is this some kind of setup? The story was already spreading before I could even breathe properly again. Brooklyn's legs wobbled as she tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. Her husband stood frozen near the patio, confusion and shame battling on his face. The perfect image of our family, the one she had polished for neighbors, friends, and social media, shattered in front of everyone, piece by piece, like the reflection of light on the pond. They carried me into the house to warm up. My clothes clung to my skin, the smell of lake water and fear mixed in the air. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. Outside, the pond looked calm again. Only small ripples remained where everything had happened. The truth had risen quiet, but undeniable, floating there like a mirror that could no longer lie. When I was younger, my world was made of flowers and sunlight. I owned a small shop on Main Street called Flower Studio, a place that somehow became the heart of Lakeview. People used to say I could make roses talk and lilies sing. Weddings, grand openings, even funerals, my flowers were there for every chapter of people's lives. I remember staying up past midnight, trimming stems, arranging petals, until each bouquet told a story of its own. Some said I was too perfectionist, but I never saw it that way. I simply believed that beauty deserved respect, and every flower, no matter how fragile, had a purpose. They called me the Hand of Spring, a name that always made me smile quietly. When my marriage ended, the scent of flowers was the only thing that stayed with me. My husband left for another state with his new wife, leaving me to raise our only son. It was a wound I never spoke of, not even to him. I learned that silence could be strength. Instead of bitterness, I poured everything into my work and into my boy. I watched him grow strong and kind, and I told myself that would be enough. There were nights when loneliness sat across the table like an old friend, but I faced it with grace. Even after retiring, people in the neighborhood still greeted me with warmth. I walked through Lakeview's quiet streets in my cream sweater flat shoes and a soft smile. The younger women often waved, some asking for advice about life or love, others simply admiring how calm I seemed. They didn't know the price of that calm, the years it took to build a life that looked peaceful, the effort it took to forgive and keep moving forward. Dignity. I learned isn't about wealth or power. It's about how you carry pain without letting it turn you cruel. I never allowed myself to gossip, to envy, or to beg for sympathy. My garden bloomed every season because I treated it with care, and maybe in some quiet way, I hoped people would do the same with their hearts. I thought I had built a life strong enough to withstand anything. But I was wrong. The danger didn't come from strangers. It came from inside the family I thought I had raised right. My son, Gavin Richardson, is 38 now, a respected surgeon, the kind of man people in town point to with admiration. But to me, he will always be the boy who once fell asleep on the flower shop counter while I finished an order of roses. I raised him alone after the divorce, spending countless nights arranging bouquets until my fingers cracked just to pay his tuition. There were nights when I worked through the smell of glue and damp stems, whispering to myself that every petal I touched was another step toward his future. When he graduated from medical school, standing there in his white coat, I thought my heart would burst. I told everyone that day, my greatest masterpiece isn't Flower Studio, it's my son. He was my pride, my reason to keep moving, the proof that sacrifice had meaning. I never once regretted the sleepless nights or the loneliness that came with raising him alone. I thought love given freely would always circle back, and for a long time it did. He used to call every evening just to ask if I'd eaten, if the roses were blooming, if the shop still smelled like spring. But things changed the year he married Brooklyn Meyer, a young nurse with a bright smile and words sweet enough to melt anyone's defenses. At first, I tried to like her. She was polite, attentive, always knowing the right things to say. But I soon realized that her charm was like perfume, pleasant on the surface, but gone too quickly to be real. After the wedding, Gavin's visits grew fewer. He said the hospital kept him busy, but even when he did come by, he wasn't alone. Brooklyn was always there, her hand on his arm, her voice answering questions meant for him. I found myself waiting for moments when she would leave the room so I could speak to my son without feeling like an intruder. Sometimes during dinner, she would subtly change the topic whenever I tried to talk about old times. Gavin never noticed. Or maybe he did, but he didn't want to choose sides. I couldn't blame him. Love can blind a man faster than hate ever could. But still, I missed the version of him who used to laugh with me over burnt toast, who once promised that no matter what, I would always be home to him. Now I had to ask permission to share a conversation with my own child, a quiet humiliation I never thought motherhood would bring. From the very first day, Brooklyn knew how to make people like her. She had that polished charm, the kind that came with a bright smile, soft laughter, and perfectly timed compliments. She called me Mom Zoe, in a sugary voice that could melt anyone's guard. Every visit, she arrived with a basket of oat cookies and bottles of vitamin milk, always insisting they were for your health. Mom, you have to stay strong for us. I smiled and thanked her, even when something in her tone felt rehearsed, like a line from a play she had performed many times before. At first, I told myself she was simply thoughtful, but over time, the sweetness started to taste strange. Between cheerful chats about flowers or Gavin's hospital shifts, she began slipping in questions that didn't belong in small talk. Mom, she'd say, casually arranging her hair, do you still keep a separate savings account just in case? Or sometimes with a faint laugh, have you ever thought about writing a will, just to be organized? Her words came with the softness of concern, but her eyes always wandered elsewhere. More than once, I caught her gaze drifting toward the corner of my bedroom, where an old safe sat beneath the dresser. It wasn't large or fancy, just something I had kept for years, holding papers, insurance documents, a few pieces of jewelry with sentimental value. The way her eyes lingered there told me she knew exactly what was inside. I pretended not to notice, busying my hands with teacups or flower stems, but every time she visited, the same chill crawled under my skin. I tried to answer her politely the way a mother should. I'm still healthy, dear, I told her one afternoon, when she asked again about inheritance plans. It's not time to think about such things. My voice was calm, but it left a silence behind, thick and cold. She smiled awkwardly, brushing it off with another compliment about my garden. But the warmth in her eyes was gone. What replaced it was calculation, quiet, patient, hidden behind that perfect grin. I had spent my life reading people's faces while arranging flowers for their weddings and funerals. There was always something telling in the eyes: love, grief, greed. Brooklyn's eyes carried all three, but it was greed that shone brightest when she thought no one saw. After the afternoon, I refused to discuss my will. Something in Brooklyn's tone changed, not loudly, not rudely, but in small, deliberate ways that cut deeper than shouting ever could. The phone calls that used to come twice a week stopped without explanation. The visits grew rare, then vanished altogether. When I called to ask if my granddaughter could spend the weekend with me, Brooklyn's voice was sugar-coated as always, but her words were sharp underneath. "Oh, Mom, I'd love to. But the little one's been catching colds so easily. You know how fragile kids can be." I heard laughter in the background, not my granddaughter's, but hers. At first I believed her. I even bought new blankets, extra vitamins, small toys to make my house more comfortable for the child. But week after week, excuses piled up like fallen leaves: school projects, sleepovers, the weather. Slowly I realized it wasn't about germs or busy schedules. It was about control, about keeping that little girl away from me long enough for her to forget what my arms felt like. When Gavin finally called, his voice was tired, distracted, full of good intentions and blind spots. "Mom, don't take it personally," he said between yawns. "Brooklyn's juggling a lot lately. Work the kid, the house. Give her some time." His words were kind but distant, like they came from someone standing behind glass. I wanted to tell him that something was wrong, that kindness shouldn't feel like a closed door. But I didn't. A mother knows when her son's mind is already elsewhere, so I smiled, even though he couldn't see it through the phone. "Of course, dear," I said softly. "I understand." And I did, just not in the way he thought. I understood that the woman who had once called me Mom Zoe was quietly erasing me from her version of the family, one polite excuse at a time. The house felt quieter after that. The flower vases stayed empty longer. Some mornings I still set an extra plate at the breakfast table, forgetting that no one was coming. In the stillness, I told myself that loneliness doesn't kill, but it can bruise the heart until it forgets how to trust. I had built this family with my own hands, the same hands that once arranged flowers into beauty. And yet now those same hands had no one left to hold. That afternoon, I made a pot of chamomile tea, the same kind my granddaughter loved. The scent filled the kitchen, warm, gentle, almost enough to fool me into thinking she was still here. I carried the cup to the small table by the window, where she used to sit and make flower crowns out of wild daisies. The tiny chair was still there, waiting. Beside it sat her pink plastic cup, untouched for weeks. The dried petals in the vase had turned brittle, their colors faded, but I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. Every petal felt like a memory, fragile, stubborn, refusing to disappear even as time marched on. The house had grown too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest instead of soothing it. I used to think peace was something you could build, but now it felt more like something that slipped through your fingers when you weren't looking. Every room still carried her laughter, faint echoes that came and went with the breeze. Sometimes I caught myself setting out 2 cups of tea, then stopping midway when I remembered there was no small hand waiting to reach for the other one. As the sun dipped low, I decided to open the old flower studio, something I hadn't done in months. The bell above the door gave its familiar soft chime, and the scent of lavender and essential oils wrapped around me like an old friend. The shelves were dusty, but the colors of dried bouquets still clung to the air. For years, this shop had been my heartbeat, full of stories, weddings, farewells. Now it felt like a museum of my own life. Customers had stopped coming regularly, faces changed, and the world moved on without asking if I was ready. I stood by the counter running my fingers along the old register, remembering the nights when the shop buzzed with laughter and the hum of work. Gavin's school photos still hung on the wall, edges curling, smiling back at me from another lifetime. I whispered to the empty room, "You've seen everything, haven't you?" The sound of my own voice startled me. It was strange how a space once filled with so many lives could feel so hollow. Time doesn't just take away youth, it takes away witnesses, the people who knew who you were before you became just an old woman, sipping tea by herself. Every weekend I kept the same quiet ritual, a basket of fresh flowers in one hand, a tin of homemade cookies in the other. I always rang the bell first, never walking in without permission. Old manners die hard, I suppose. Gavin's house was only 20 minutes away, yet every visit felt like stepping into another world, one that used to be warm, but now shimmered with a kind of cold politeness. When Gavin opened the door, he always looked tired, but glad. "Mom, you didn't have to bring anything," he'd say, hugging me quickly before rushing back to his phone or medical notes. Then Brooklyn appeared, all brightness and grace. Her smile could have lit the entire room. "Mom, Zoe, you're here. You make every weekend feel special." She'd chirp, already setting out teacups. "I just brewed your favorite chamomile tea. Sit, please, you've done enough in life. Let us take care of you now." Her tone was smooth, almost too smooth, every word dipped in honey. Gavin would beam at her, clearly proud. To him, she was the perfect daughter-in-law, attentive, sweet, devoted. But underneath her gestures, I could feel the edge of something sharper. The way she emphasized "you've done enough" wasn't kindness. It was dismissal dressed as affection. She wanted me to sit still, to smile, to disappear quietly from the center of their lives. I watched her move through the kitchen, pouring tea, laughing at Gavin's stories, occasionally glancing my way with that polished nurse's smile, the one that comforted patients but concealed detachment. I wondered if Gavin ever noticed how her hand tightened on the teapot when I mentioned my granddaughter's name, or how she redirected the conversation each time I tried to offer advice. He never did. To him, the scene looked perfect, his wife and his mother finally getting along. Sometimes, when she leaned over to place a cup in front of me, she'd whisper softly enough for only me to hear. "You shouldn't worry so much, Mom. Let go a little. Enjoy retirement." Her eyes didn't match her words, they gleamed with quiet victory. I smiled back, too polite to answer. I had learned long ago that silence can be more powerful than confrontation. Still, it hurt to watch my own son mistake performance for peace. From where I sat, surrounded by the scent of tea and roses, I saw it clearly. The perfect illusion Brooklyn had built, delicate as lace, dangerous as glass. The moment Gavin left for work, the house changed. The warmth that filled it when he was home evaporated in seconds, leaving behind something sharp and cold. Brooklyn's smile faded as easily as turning off a light. Her voice, once sweet and melodic, became clipped, deliberate, soaked in quiet contempt. "You know, Mom," she said one morning, stirring her coffee without looking at me, "older people should really rest instead of trying to teach others how to live." The words were soft, but each syllable landed like ice against my skin. I wanted to believe I had misheard, that maybe she was just tired. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise, calm, steady, and certain. I had seen that look before, not in my family, but in people who thought kindness was weakness. I said nothing, only smiled faintly, pretending I hadn't understood. Silence, I thought, was safer than pride. Later that afternoon, I offered to teach my granddaughter how to plant flowers or make essential oils, something simple to connect us. Brooklyn laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "Children should learn STEM, not flower arranging," she said, crossing her arms. "The world doesn't need more dreamers." Her tone was polite enough to pass for conversation, but her eyes made it clear. My world, my values were nothing but relics to her. I looked toward the window where the garden sunlight filtered through the glass. It had always been my way of showing love through creation, not argument. So before leaving, I placed a small fruit tart on the kitchen counter and tied a lavender bouquet with a white ribbon, leaving it beside the sink. Little things, gestures that once meant family to me. "Tell Gavin I stopped by," I said quietly, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. As I walked down the front path, I heard the faint creak of the trash lid behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I knew that the tart and the lavender had already found their way into the garbage the same way she wanted to discard everything that tied Gavin to me. The air smelled faintly of mint and detergent, too clean, too sterile, like a place where affection was disinfected before it could survive. Some wounds don't bleed, they echo in the sound of something being thrown away. It started as a feeling, a small unease that I kept brushing aside until it grew too loud to ignore. Something inside that house no longer felt right. The air itself had changed colder, heavier. Every time I reached out to hug my granddaughter, I caught the quick flicker in Brooklyn's eyes, a flash of ice, before she replaced it with her practiced smile. Once, when I went to fetch a book from the living room shelf, I noticed her quietly locking a cabinet drawer, her movements smooth but urgent. She looked up, pretending nothing had happened, and offered me tea. That smile again, too perfect, too polished to be real. At first, I told myself it was paranoia, that maybe I was getting old and suspicious. But mothers don't imagine danger, they sense it. And one afternoon, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Brooklyn was in the kitchen, talking softly on the phone. I hadn't meant to overhear, but her voice carried through the hallway. If she already made the will, she whispered, "I need a copy of it. My husband won't suspect a thing." There was a pause, a muffled laugh, and then silence. I stood frozen, one hand on the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the rest. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my writing desk, the light from the small lamp trembling across the pages of my old diary. My hand shook slightly as I wrote the words that had been circling in my head all evening. When someone wants to take what is yours, they begin with sweetness. It wasn't just a thought. It was a truth I had learned the hard way, that greed never comes wearing its real face. I looked around my study at the papers I had neatly kept for years: bank books, property deeds, old letters, even the will I had drafted months ago, but never mentioned to Gavin. For the first time, I felt afraid of my own home, afraid of the hands that might one day turn those papers into weapons. So I made a decision. The next morning, I gathered every important document and made copies, slow, careful, deliberate. I sealed them in a folder and sent them to my longtime lawyer, Mr. Harris, with a short note for safekeeping, confidential. As the postman's truck disappeared down the street, I stood by the window, my reflection pale against the glass. The sky outside was calm, the garden blooming as always. Yet deep down I knew peace had already left my life. What remained was a quiet war, one that would be fought not with words, but with patience and proof. One afternoon I called Gavin with a simple thought that had been warming my heart for weeks. "Honey," I said, trying to sound cheerful, "let me host your daughter's birthday at my garden this year. She loves the sunflowers, and I can decorate the place beautifully. She'll be so happy." There was a pause on the other end before Gavin replied, his voice tired but kind. "That sounds wonderful, Mom. I'll let Brooklyn know." I thanked him, smiling to myself as I imagined balloons, cake, and laughter filling the yard again the way it used to when my son was small. When Brooklyn finally called back, her voice carried that polite sweetness she reserved for moments when others were listening. "Of course, Mom Zoe," she said, "how could we say no to your garden? Everyone in Lakeview knows you have the most beautiful house." But behind the softness, I heard reluctance, the kind of hesitance that comes not from respect, but from calculation. I brushed it off, choosing to believe in good intentions. A mother's heart often does. What I didn't know was that her acceptance had nothing to do with love or gratitude. In the Lakeview community, appearances mattered more than truth. My name still carried weight: the woman who ran the beloved flower studio, the lady who had given her life to art and family. Brooklyn, ever the strategist, knew refusing me would look ungrateful. She couldn't afford whispers about being the daughter-in-law who denied her child's grandmother a simple joy, and so she agreed not out of kindness, but out of pride. In her mind, though, something else began to form, a plan, a way to turn my own generosity into her advantage. It'll be the perfect chance, she thought, though I would only realize this much later, to take back what belongs to my husband and what should have been mine all along. I spent the following week preparing, blissfully unaware of the shadow growing behind her smiles. I polished the old tea set and trimmed the hydrangeas until they gleamed in the afternoon light. I told my neighbors about the upcoming celebration, their eyes lighting up as they spoke of how beautiful it would be. None of us knew we were building a stage, one where kindness would meet betrayal, and where a birthday meant for laughter would instead mark the beginning of a crime disguised as an accident. Planning the birthday should have been a joy, but instead it turned into a quiet battlefield, a war fought with flowers, frosting, and false smiles. Every little detail became an argument wrapped in politeness. I suggested a classic vanilla cake, the kind my granddaughter loved, simple and sweet. Brooklyn pursed her lips, scrolling on her phone. "Vanilla feels dated, Mom Zoe." I found a bakery that does minimalist fondant cakes with pistachio cream. It's cleaner, more modern, and much more expensive, but worth it. Her tone wasn't asking for approval. It was a declaration. I nodded through the taste of vanilla, warm, familiar, lingered in my memory like a lost song. Then came the tablecloths. I had chosen white with lavender embroidery, soft and cheerful. Brooklyn arrived the next morning with boxes and assistants, all in sleek black uniforms. "We're switching to gray and charcoal," she said briskly. "It looks more sophisticated for photos." I stared at the dark fabric draped across the tables and whispered under my breath, "Is this a birthday or a funeral?" She didn't hear me, or maybe she did and didn't care. Even the guest list became a war zone. I had invited neighbors, old friends, and the children from down the street, who often played with my granddaughter. But when I checked the final RSVP list Brooklyn had emailed out, I barely recognized the names. Influencers, colleagues, and her stylish friends from the hospital, people who didn't even know the birthday girl. It wasn't a celebration anymore. It was a performance, a chance for her to flaunt her version of perfection. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up in the kitchen, arranging the centerpiece bouquet. I chose yellow sunflowers and white lilies, bright, hopeful symbols of happiness and purity. My hands moved slowly but lovingly, binding the stems with a soft, ivory ribbon. I thought of my granddaughter's laughter and how her little hands once helped me tie bows just like this. When I finished, I placed the bouquet on the main table and stood there for a long while, admiring its quiet beauty under the warm lamplight. But the next morning, when I came down to set the plates, my heart stopped. The flowers were crushed stems, broken petals torn, water spilled across the cloth like tears. Someone had destroyed them deliberately. The lilies lay bent, their white edges bruised and brown. I knelt beside the table, my fingers trembling as I gathered the remains. The garden outside was still, but inside the silence roared. I didn't need proof to know who had done it. Some battles are fought not with words, but with cruelty dressed as elegance. The afternoon sunlight spilled gently across the garden, warm, but not too bright, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it truly is. Children's laughter echoed between the trees as balloons swayed above the tables. The white frosted cake stood at the center, surrounded by ribbons, flowers, and glittering candles. Everything appeared flawless, the perfect suburban celebration. At least that's what Brooklyn wanted everyone to see. She moved through the crowd like a hostess from a lifestyle magazine, smiling, posing, making sure every camera caught her best angle. The neighbors gathered near the buffet, sipping lemonade and murmuring with admiration. "Brooklyn has such taste," one woman whispered. "You can tell she's a professional. Everything looks perfect." I heard them standing nearby and smiled faintly, not out of pride but exhaustion. Most of the details they praised: the flowers, the place settings, even the handwritten name cards were things I had stayed up late to finish. But I didn't correct them. I let the lie breathe quiet and harmless, because sometimes truth only invites discomfort. Brooklyn floated past me, her perfume trailing behind like a declaration. She complimented the guests, adjusted the napkins, straightened the silverware, but her eyes, sharp and restless, never lingered on the cake or the children. They flicked again and again toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. Behind that door was the safe. Nothing extravagant, just family documents, a few old jewels, the will, and some memories locked away for peace of mind. Yet from the way she looked, you'd think treasure waited there. "Mom," "Zoe," she said sweetly, approaching me with a dish towel in hand. "I think one of the kids spilled juice near the gift table. I'll grab some napkins from inside." I nodded, busy pouring lemonade for the children, not noticing how tightly she clutched her phone, or how fast her heels clicked across the garden path. Her stilettos left small imprints on the soft, daisy-covered carpet, tiny wounds across the earth, just like the ones she left on every heart she touched. For the next few minutes, laughter and chatter filled the air, and I thought nothing of it. Guests admired the flowers children sang, and the candles flickered prettily in the gentle breeze. It wasn't until later, after the cake was cut and the gifts were opened, that I noticed how long Brooklyn had been gone. A neighbor mentioned seeing her walk toward the house earlier, but not return. My chest tightened, though I didn't know why. The garden looked perfect, but somewhere behind those walls, perfection was cracking quietly, like porcelain under too much pressure. I remember hearing the faint creak of the door and thinking it was just the wind. But now looking back, I know that was the moment Brooklyn entered my room. The air inside still carried my scent. Rose and lavender, the blend I'd used for years to calm my nerves and make the house feel like home. I had left the curtains half open so the afternoon light rested softly on the wooden dresser. It was the room that held everything I treasured, not just objects, but memories. I never imagined that someone from my own family would step into it with such intent. Brooklyn must have looked around first, taking in the order I kept. I can almost picture her now standing in her heels, eyes scanning for the safe she knew existed. She would have seen the polished wood, the silver-framed photographs, the bouquet of dried lavender by the mirror. And then she would have found it the drawer beneath the dresser, the one I had carelessly left unlocked because I still believed my home was a place of trust. Inside that drawer was a small wooden box carved with my initials, ZR. It held the jewelry from my 40th wedding anniversary, a sapphire ring, pearl earrings, and a golden necklace. My late husband had given them to me the year before he left. I never wore them much anymore, but they were the last pieces of a life I once knew. Brooklyn must have opened the box and watched the light catch the stones. She would have seen not just gold and gems, but the value she had been searching for. I can almost hear her whisper the words sliding out like venom. If she won't share her inheritance, I'll take my share myself. I wasn't there to stop her, but I can imagine her hands trembling not from fear, but from greed. She took each piece, carefully slid them into a small plastic bag, and tucked it beneath her dress. The way she plans things, she probably thought it was perfect. Before leaving, she must have checked the room, rearranging the pillows, closing the drawer, pretending nothing happened. But fate is never that tidy. Later, when I returned and opened the curtains wider, I saw it a single fingerprint smudged across the surface of my vanity mirror. A small trace of her presence, clear and undeniable. That evening, as the house filled again with laughter from the garden, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at that mark. My hands trembled, not with anger, but with something colder realization. My daughter-in-law had not just stolen my jewelry. She had stolen the peace I once felt inside my own walls. I wasn't there when it happened, but later when the truth came out, I could picture it all too clearly. The sunlight through the window, the faint creak of the floorboards, and Brooklyn's startled face as my granddaughter burst into the room. She must have been just playing hide and seek, running on tiny feet down the hallway. The door flew open, and her laughter filled the air like a bell. "Mommy, I found you," she said, throwing her little arms around her mother's legs. Brooklyn froze, the smile on her lips, stiff and unnatural. The small plastic bag in her hand nearly slipped through her fingers, the stolen jewelry glinting faintly in the afternoon light. For a second, she didn't breathe. I can almost imagine her eyes darting wildly from the dresser to the bed, from the window to the floor, searching for a place to hide what she'd taken. But there was no time. The sound of voices drifted from the garden outside, footsteps approaching. She panicked. In that single, desperate moment, her instinct chose the cruelest solution. "Sweetheart," she said softly, bending down so their faces were level. "Can you help Mommy with something?" Her voice was sugar-sweet, trembling slightly, but her hands were cold and clumsy. She slipped the small plastic bag into the pocket of her daughter's little dress and whispered, "Keep this for Mommy, okay? Don't tell anyone. It's a surprise." The little girl, innocent as sunlight, nodded eagerly. "Okay, Mommy," she said, her face lighting up with joy at being trusted. She had no idea what she was holding, no idea that her tiny hands now carried a secret heavy enough to destroy everything. She skipped toward the door, humming completely unaware that the plastic bag rustled quietly in her pocket. Brooklyn straightened, wiping her palms on her skirt, forcing herself to breathe. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She checked the room one last time, making sure the drawer was closed. The mirror wiped clean, unaware that her fingerprints still gleamed faintly on the glass. Then she turned toward the door, smoothing her hair, calling out in the same cheerful voice everyone knew. "Come on, sweetie, let's go join Grandma outside." Down in the garden, I saw them walking hand in hand, sunlight dancing in my granddaughter's curls. I remember thinking how beautiful that moment was, a mother and daughter so close. I didn't know that in that tiny pocket beneath the folds of a pink dress, my past and her deceit were already tangled together. That afternoon by the pond still lives inside me like a shadow that refuses to fade. The air was warm, the sunlight soft on the surface of the water. I had taken my granddaughter's small hand in mine, and together we carried a basket of flowers, yellow daisies, her favorite. It was our little ritual every year we would set the petals afloat and make a wish for her birthday. For luck and for kindness, I always told her. She laughed, tossing a handful of blossoms into the breeze, her voice bright and alive. Behind us, I could hear Brooklyn's footsteps on the grass. She was smiling, or trying to. There was tension in her every move, the kind that doesn't come from exhaustion, but from fear. Her voice quivered as she said, "That's lovely, Mom Zoe. So beautiful." I turned to smile back, but her eyes weren't on me or the flowers. They were fixed on her daughter, watching every movement with unnatural intensity. I didn't know then that what she was really afraid of wasn't danger, it was discovery. She was terrified that the child might drop the secret she had slipped into that tiny pocket. The laughter of children floated across the garden, innocent and pure. The pond shimmered with petals, gold and white, spinning gently on the surface. I remember kneeling down to help my granddaughter release the last few flowers when it happened. A sharp gasp, a quick slip, and then the scream that tore through the air. "Mommy," she cried as her small body tumbled forward, breaking the reflection of the sky. Time shattered with the sound of that splash. I dropped the basket, heart pounding, reaching out instinctively. But before I could even move toward the edge, I felt a force slam against my back hard, sudden, merciless. The world tilted, and the next thing I knew, the water swallowed me whole. "Save her, Mom. Save my baby." Brooklyn's voice echoed above, wild and trembling, but not from panic, from performance. Her scream pierced the chaos, commanding the scene like an actress who knew her lines too well. I flailed beneath the surface, the cold stealing my breath, my limbs heavy and slow. I heard splashes, voices shouting, but none of it reached me. All I could think was of my granddaughter somewhere near the surface crying for help. I had never learned to swim. Brooklyn knew that. Everyone in the family knew that. And yet, she stood above me pretending to plead, pretending to grieve while letting the water do her work. That day, the pond was no longer a place of wishes. It became a mirror of deceit, and beneath its calm surface, innocence and malice met for the first time. I still remember the sound before anything else, the crash of glass, the shrill cries, the chaos that ripped through the garden like a storm. One moment, there had been laughter and the scent of cake. The next, screams echoed over the pond. Chairs toppled, plates shattered, children clung to their mothers, their cries sharp and panicked. Someone shouted, "Call 911," and I could faintly hear the voice of Mr. Jones, our retired neighbor, commanding people to move back. But under the water, all I could hear was silence, heavy and endless. The cold bit into my skin as I fought to reach the surface. My dress wrapped around my legs, dragging me down like hands made of silk and gravity. My lungs burned. Through the blur of water and light, I saw her, my granddaughter, sinking just an arm's length away. Her small hand was still clenched, clutching something shiny. The faint glint of gold flickered like a dying flame. Even in that moment, I understood the bag Brooklyn had hidden. My heart screamed, though my mouth filled with water. That tiny piece of deceit had followed her into the depths. Then a splash above. A dark shape broke the surface, Mr. Jones plunging into the water with surprising strength for his age. Behind him, Linda, our neighbor, followed without hesitation. "Grab the girl," he shouted, and the water churned as their arms cut through it. I felt a hand brush against mine, firm and insistent, pulling me upward. My body screamed for air as I was dragged toward the sunlight. When we finally broke the surface, the world roared back. People were shouting, sobbing. Linda held my granddaughter close, pounding her small back until the child coughed, gasped, and began to cry. The sound was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I collapsed beside them, choking and trembling, my chest heaving with each breath of air that felt both a gift and a punishment. Then, amid the confusion, someone screamed, "Look!" All eyes turned toward the pond. Something floated near the edge, a small plastic bag spinning slowly in the ripples. The sun caught it just right and it gleamed. Mr. Jones waded forward and reached for it. The bag opened as it touched the water's surface, spilling its contents: a sapphire ring, a pair of pearl earrings, a golden necklace. They glittered beneath the fading light, each piece shimmering like the truth finally breaking free. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the children stopped crying. The world seemed to hold its breath as those jewels drifted toward the shore, silent, damning witnesses to what had been done. And in that stillness, I felt something deeper than fear, the quiet weight of justice beginning to rise, shining as cold and pure as the water that had nearly claimed me. The world around me blurred when they pulled us from the water. I remember coughing, gasping for air, and feeling the sting of cold against my skin. My arms trembled as I clutched my granddaughter close. Her small body was shaking, but she was breathing. That was all that mattered. Around us, chaos reigned, voices shouting, children crying, someone draping a blanket over my shoulders. Mr. Jones and Linda knelt beside me, soaked and panting, their faces pale from shock, but filled with relief. "You're both alive," Mr. Jones said, his voice hoarse. "You're safe now." But the garden was no longer the same. What had been laughter and celebration minutes ago now felt heavy with suspicion. The water, once clear and calm, carried something else, the final piece of truth I had been too blind to see. Floating just beyond the lily pads, a torn plastic bag drifted toward the edge. Its contents shimmered beneath the sunlight like scattered stars. Linda noticed first. "Wait," she whispered, pointing. Mr. Jones waded forward and reached into the water. When he lifted it, the air seemed to still. Inside the torn bag lay my sapphire ring, my pearl earrings, and the golden necklace that had vanished from my drawer days earlier, the very things I thought had been stolen by fate. The crowd fell silent. The children stopped crying. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Someone murmured, "Didn't Mrs. Zoe say she'd lost that jewelry?" The words spread like ripples on the pond, touching every ear, settling in every gaze. People turned toward me, then slowly toward Brooklyn. I lifted my head, still weak, my hair dripping over my face. My vision swam, but when I looked at her, everything became clear. Brooklyn stood frozen among the guests, her hands clasped tightly, her smile gone. The color had drained from her face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint clinking of the jewelry in Mr. Jones's hands. I took a breath, deep and unsteady. The truth I said quietly, my voice rough from water and grief, always finds its way to the surface. Her eyes flickered panic, breaking through the mask she wore so carefully. The guests exchanged glances. No one dared speak, but I could feel the shift, the weight of realization pressing down on the air. In that single moment, I wasn't the frail old woman they pitied. I was the witness, the survivor. And the truth, shining brighter than the gold in that bag, had chosen its own moment to rise. The sound of her tiny voice cut through the noise like glass breaking. Everyone had been talking at once, shouting, crying, calling for towels and blankets until my granddaughter spoke. "Mommy?" She coughed weakly, still trembling in Linda's arms. "Mommy put this in my pocket and told me not to tell." Her words came out slow, innocent trembling with both fear and truth. The world stopped. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the garden itself was holding its breath. A few bubbles rose from the surface of the pond, bursting softly, the only sound in the heavy stillness. I stared at her, my sweet little girl, her wet hair sticking to her cheeks, her small hand clutching the edge of Linda's sleeve. Her voice had no malice, only confusion, the kind that comes when a child doesn't yet understand the weight of her words. Brooklyn's face went pale. For a second, she didn't breathe. Then, like an actress remembering her cue, she let out a sudden sob. "Oh my God!" she cried, her voice shaking but rehearsed. "She's in shock. She doesn't know what she's saying." Her hands fluttered uselessly in the air, then reached toward her daughter, but Linda stepped slightly aside, keeping the child close. The guests exchanged glances, confusion, suspicion, disbelief, and the murmur of whispers spread like wildfire. Mr. Jones, still dripping wet, looked between us with furrowed brows. "What did the girl say?" someone whispered. Another guest repeated the words softer this time, as if saying them out loud made them more dangerous. "Mommy put this in my pocket." Brooklyn tried again, louder, desperate. "She's just scared. She almost drowned. You can't believe everything she says." But her voice cracked at the edges, the tone too sharp, too defensive. The more she spoke, the guiltier she sounded. Then Linda, calm but firm, turned to face her. "I've worked with trauma patients for 20 years, she said, her voice steady enough to quiet the crowd. "I know when someone's confused, and I know when someone's telling the truth. That child isn't lying." The silence that followed was deafening. Brooklyn froze, her hands dropping to her sides. The tears on her face stopped just as suddenly as they had begun. Around her, the guests began to step back, their eyes shifting the way people do when they recognize something dark they'd rather not see. I looked at my granddaughter, then at the bag of jewelry still glinting in the sunlight. My heart ached for the innocence that had exposed such cruelty. She didn't mean to destroy her mother. She only spoke the truth, and the truth once spoken cannot be taken back. When Gavin arrived, I barely recognized him. The sound of sirens had faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel as his car skidded into the driveway. He ran across the lawn, still in his white hospital coat, his face pale and drenched with sweat. His breath came fast, ragged. He didn't look like a doctor in that moment. He looked like a terrified son and a desperate father. He dropped to his knees beside our granddaughter, first, checking her pulse, brushing wet hair from her forehead. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The child nodded weakly, still wrapped in a towel. Then his eyes lifted and found me. I was sitting on the grass, covered in a blanket, my clothes heavy with water. My hands shook, but my mind was strangely clear. When our eyes met, he froze because I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was just calm. A kind of calm that only comes when the truth no longer hides. "Mom," he breathed, kneeling closer. "What happened?" Before I could answer, Mr. Jones spoke quietly, explaining everything: the scream, the push, the jewelry, the child's words. Each sentence fell heavier than the last. I watched Gavin's expression shift: confusion, disbelief, then something darker. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. When Mr. Jones finished, the silence was suffocating. Brooklyn stood a few steps away, her hair tangled mascara streaking down her cheeks. She looked wild, part wounded, part furious. "Gavin," she cried, her voice rising, "you can't seriously believe this. They're all lying. Your mother hates me. She's always wanted to turn you against me." She stumbled closer, grabbing his arm. "Think, please. Why would I ever do something like this?" He didn't answer. He just stared at her, his face a storm of conflict. The doctor in him searched for logic, for evidence. The son in him felt the weight of years of trust and guilt. "Brooklyn," he said slowly, "the jewelry. How did it end up in our daughter's pocket?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. The crowd was silent, every breath hanging in the air. Her eyes darted toward me, then to the ground. She began to shake her head, her voice breaking into sobs. I don't know. She's lying. She must have found it and... Enough," he said quietly. His tone was calm, but final. He looked at me. Then his eyes filled with pain, not just for what had happened, but for everything he hadn't seen until it was too late. And in that moment, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I realized something I hadn't expected. I no longer needed to shout or fight or defend myself. The truth had already chosen its side. The smell of antiseptic filled the room, sharp and clean, the kind of scent that always made me feel both safe and uneasy. I lay there beneath the soft hospital sheets, my body still aching from the shock of the cold water. The doctor had assured me that I was lucky, only mild hypothermia, and a few scratches, lucky. I had almost drowned, my granddaughter had nearly died, and the person responsible was still walking free. But yes, I was lucky. When Gavin entered the room, he looked exhausted. His white coat was gone, his shirt half untucked, and his eyes red, not from lack of sleep, but from crying. It had been years since I last saw tears in my son's eyes. Not since the day his father left. He sat beside my bed without a word and took my hand. His grip trembled, and I could feel the guilt running through him like a current. "Mom," he whispered, voice breaking. "I should have seen it sooner." I squeezed his hand gently. "No, son," I said, my voice quiet, but steady. "You couldn't. You believed in the woman you loved. That isn't a weakness." I took a slow breath before continuing, my tone colder now. "But when someone is willing to use her own child to hide her lies, that isn't just a mistake. That's who she truly is." Gavin looked at me silent, his face caught between pain and resolve. A knock sounded at the door. Mr. Patrick Hale stepped in gray suit, neat tie, calm eyes. He had been our family's lawyer for years, the one who helped me secure the Flower Studio property and handle my savings after the divorce. Gavin had called him earlier that morning. Patrick listened carefully as we explained everything: the jewelry, the staged accident, the child's confession, the crowd of witnesses. He nodded slowly, taking notes in his small leather book. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much human deceit to be surprised anymore. "Mrs. Richardson," he said, looking directly at me, "if you're ready to take this to court, we have grounds, multiple in fact. Intentional endangerment theft and deliberate manipulation of circumstances to deflect blame. It's all there." Gavin straightened, his jaw set. For the first time since that awful day, I saw something familiar in his eyes, the strength he had inherited from me. "Do it," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." I nodded, feeling a strange calm wash over me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming truth, dignity, and the peace that woman had tried to steal. I looked out the window, the morning sun reflected off the hospital glass, bright and blinding. "Let's begin," I said softly. When I returned home from the hospital, the air in the house felt different, still watchful, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. Everything was exactly where I had left it, except for the faint scent of lavender that lingered like a reminder of what had happened. I moved slowly through each room, the same way I used to walk through my flower studio after closing observant, calculating calm. People often mistook gentleness for weakness, but I had learned long ago that flowers taught more than beauty. They taught patience, timing, and the art of strategy. That night, as I sat at my desk going through papers, a thought struck me like a spark. The cameras. I had almost forgotten. Months ago, I'd installed 2 small security cameras, one facing the back garden after someone had stolen my roses, and another near my bedroom porch to deter raccoons. I turned on the computer, my fingers trembling slightly as I opened the footage. The timestamp read the same afternoon as the party. The first video showed what I expected: children running, guests laughing, balloons swaying in the wind. But then around 3:42 p.m., Brooklyn appeared. She was alone, heels clicking against the stone path, her face tight with something between panic and calculation. She glanced around before slipping through the back door of the house. 3 minutes later, she re-emerged, hair disheveled, eyes wide, clutching her phone as if her life depended on it. The timestamps matched perfectly with the moment the jewelry disappeared and the chaos began by the pond. I replayed the clip twice more, each time feeling the same mixture of anger and relief. There it was, proof clean and undeniable. Not just my word against hers anymore, but the cold, unblinking eye of a camera. I copied the footage onto 2 drives and sealed them in separate envelopes. The next morning, I invited Mr. Jones over. He arrived in uniform slacks and a pressed shirt, the posture of a man who had spent decades living by procedure. "You were right to call," he said, after watching the video in silence. "Chain of custody is key here. We'll make sure everything's handled by the book." He signed the affidavit as an official witness and guided me on how to submit the evidence to the local police, ensuring its legality under U.S. procedure. As I handed him the drive, I caught my reflection in the window. For a moment, I saw not a fragile old woman, but the version of myself I once was, Zoe Richardson, the florist who turned every arrangement into a message, every bloom into intent. The war had shifted from whispers to facts, from hurt to justice. And this time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was reclaiming everything that had been taken: my truth, my name, my peace. When I opened my eyes again, the world was quiet, too quiet. The sharp scent of antiseptic still clung to my skin, but I felt something stronger than pain coursing through me: resolve. 30 minutes after the doctor cleared me to leave, I was standing at the doorway of my own garden, the same place I had almost died. My legs still trembled, but I stood tall. The sunlight hit the wet grass, and the water on the surface of the pond shimmered like glass. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. "Please," I said calmly, my voice cutting through the murmurs, "no one touches the jewelry bag. Let the police handle it." The crowd parted as I stepped forward, wrapped in a thin shawl, still pale but unshaken. Brooklyn stood near the porch, mascara smeared her eyes, darting around like a trapped animal. I could feel the tension, the whispers spreading faster than wildfire. "I saw her push Mrs. Richardson," someone said from behind the hedge. "Me too," another voice chimed in. "She screamed for help, but didn't even move to save them." Their words rolled through the crowd like thunder. The perfect image Brooklyn had spent years building was cracking one whisper at a time. Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled into the driveway, red and blue lights reflecting off the pond. The local sheriff, a sturdy man named Reeves, approached me first. Notebook in hand, Mrs. Richardson, he said respectfully, we need to document everything as it happened. I nodded, keeping my composure. He then turned to Brooklyn, who tried to step forward, voice trembling. It was an accident, she insisted. She lost her balance. I tried to help, but Reeves raised a hand. We'll determine that after reviewing the evidence, he said flatly. Then he motioned to an officer. Bag the jewelry and log it as Exhibit A. The officer carefully lifted the wet plastic bag with gloved hands and sealed it in a labeled pouch. Reeves turned back to me. We'll open a case for domestic assault and theft under investigation. You did the right thing by preserving the scene. I sat down slowly, straightening my posture despite the weight of my damp clothes. The garden was silent again, but not peaceful. It was waiting. Brooklyn's sobs grew faint behind me as I adjusted the shawl over my shoulders. I looked around at the neighbors, their faces a mixture of pity, disbelief, and respect. Thank you, I said softly, but every word was deliberate. If I'm still alive today, it's because justice hasn't left this world yet. A hush fell over everyone. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying my words across the garden. For years, I had been the quiet florist, the widow with the gentle smile. But in that moment, I was something else entirely, a survivor who had turned pain into proof, silence into strength. The questions started quietly, almost politely, but the silence that followed each one was deafening. The police had set up a small perimeter in the garden, marking the area around the pond with yellow tape. The afternoon light had softened, but the tension was sharp enough to cut through air. Brooklyn sat on one of the patio chairs, her wet hair clinging to her face, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could shield her lies from the world. Mrs. Meyer. Officer Reeves began his tone calm but precise. Several witnesses saw you approach your mother-in-law moments before the incident. Can you explain why? Brooklyn's lips trembled. I panicked, she stammered. My daughter fell in. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I must have. Reeves interrupted gently, but firmly. Then explain this. He pointed toward the sealed evidence bag, lying on the nearby table, the transparent plastic glinting under the light. Why was your mother-in-law's missing jewelry found in the same water she almost drowned in? Brooklyn's face went blank. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. The murmurs around us grew louder, the sound of neighbors whispering, gasping, exchanging glances. It was the kind of silence that exposes guilt better than shouting ever could. Gavin stepped closer. He was still wearing his white hospital coat, now wrinkled and streaked with dirt. His eyes were red but steady. He looked at his wife for a long time before speaking, his voice low and heavy. Brooklyn, he said, if you're innocent, look my mother in the eye and say it. She turned toward me, her gaze flickering like a candle in the wind. I didn't move. I just met her eyes, calm, unflinching. It wasn't anger she saw there, but truth. Her lips parted, and she let out a shaky breath. Maybe our daughter. She must have found it somewhere. Maybe she dropped it near the pond. Before she could finish, a chorus of disbelief rose from the crowd. That's not true, someone shouted. You never let the girl play near the pond, another added. The sound swelled like a wave swallowing her excuses. Even the officers exchanged glances, not of surprise, but quiet confirmation. Brooklyn looked around helplessly, her voice breaking. You have to believe me, she cried, but the desperation only made her sound guiltier. Gavin's shoulders sank, his hand covering his mouth, as if he could hold back his heartbreak. Reeves closed his notebook and spoke evenly. We'll record your full statement at the station, Mrs. Meyer. For now, please remain available for questioning. His tone was professional, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent. This was no misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a case. I said nothing. I only watched as the law began its quiet, steady work, the kind of justice that doesn't shout, but cuts cleanly like truth itself. It began quietly with the soft chime of an iPad notification. I was still sitting under the canopy wrapped in my shawl when my cousin Agnes approached her face, pale but determined. She held out the device with both hands, her voice trembling. "Zoe," she said softly, "I think you should see this." The crowd shifted as she tapped the screen. The video loaded slowly, buffering for a moment. Before the image came into focus, my back porch captured from the small security camera I had installed months ago. The timestamp showed 3:42 p.m., the same time the chaos had begun. There she was, Brooklyn, walking briskly across the frame, her face, tense eyes darting side to side like someone afraid of being seen. The laughter and music from the party carried faintly through the open door, but she didn't glance back. She slipped inside the house, moving fast, her heels clicking against the tiles. The video skipped ahead 2 minutes. Then she reappeared, this time breathing hard, one hand clutching the front of her dress, the other wiping sweat from her brow. Her expression was sharp focused, but something in her eyes flickered fear or guilt. She smoothed her skirt, glanced around once more, and hurried back toward the garden. The sound that followed wasn't just a gasp. It was a collective realization. A wave of whispers rose around me like wind through dry leaves. Did she just? She went into the house during the party. God, she looks nervous, like she knew what she was doing. Someone near the back muttered, "Stealing in broad daylight." And then she staged that accident. The murmurs swelled into a storm. Guests exchanged looks, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Brooklyn stood frozen in the middle of it all, her face drained of color. That's not what it looks like," she shouted, her voice breaking. "I just went to grab a towel for the kids." But no one was listening. The evidence spoke louder than any excuse. Even the officers leaned closer to the screen, their expressions unreadable. Gavin's hand slid from his pocket, his jaw tightening as he watched the woman he once trusted crumble in front of him. I didn't move. I just sat there watching the truth unfold, not in a courtroom, but in my garden among balloons, flower petals, and the smell of birthday cake. A birthday that had turned into a tribunal. There was no judge, no jury, just the eyes of everyone who had seen enough. For years, Brooklyn had hidden behind smiles and polite words, weaving a mask so flawless that even I once believed it. But now, with the sun glinting off that screen, her mask shattered. And for the first time, the justice I had always believed in didn't come from law books or police reports. It came from the light of a simple camera and a truth that refused to stay buried. It happened so fast that even the wind seemed to stop. One moment, there was silence, the uneasy kind that comes after a storm of truth. The next, Brooklyn screamed. A raw, piercing sound that tore through the garden like shattered glass. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the table, and with a violent sweep of her arm, sent everything crashing to the ground. Plates clattered, glasses burst, frosting splattered across the grass like white ashes. The once beautiful birthday setup, balloons, flowers, and cake, became a battlefield. "You don't know anything!" she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of rage and fear. "All of you, you've been against me from the start." Her chest heaved, mascara streaking down her face, making her look almost unrecognizable. The woman who once smiled sweetly at every neighbor who brought organic cookies to every meeting was gone. What stood before us now was the truth behind the facade, desperate, cornered, and utterly undone. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the yard. Water spilled from overturned pitchers running down the tiles like tears. I watched quietly as a slice of the cake slid off the table, landing face down in the dirt. Strawberries and cream smeared together, red and white guilt and innocence blending into something unrecognizable. It was almost poetic, the way her perfect life fell apart, right where she had staged her deception. I didn't move. I simply sat, shawl still around my shoulders, my hands folded in my lap. My face was calm, but my heart had already accepted what my eyes were seeing. I had forgiven her too many times, ignored too many signs. Now I no longer needed words. The truth was screaming loud enough for both of us. Brooklyn turned to me wild-eyed. "Are you happy now?" she shouted, voice trembling. "You ruined my life." Her accusation came like a knife, but it didn't cut. It fell dull and empty like everything else she had built on lies. Gavin stood frozen beside the broken table. His lab coat was splattered with icing and tears, but he didn't move to clean it. He just stared at her, not as a husband, not as a man defending his pride, but as someone finally seeing what love had blinded him to for years. His lips parted, but no words came out. Only tears. Long, quiet tears that fell harder than her screams. The guests watched in stunned silence as she crumbled, her hands shaking, her voice fading into incoherent sobs. The sound of sirens returned in the distance, not loud, not urgent, just steady, inevitable. And as they drew closer, Brooklyn's defiance dissolved completely. The fight was over. I exhaled slowly. In that moment, I realized sometimes justice doesn't need vengeance. It simply waits for truth to destroy itself. The sun was setting when the last officer zipped his notebook shut. The flashing lights from the police cars painted streaks of red and blue across the garden, mixing with the faint scent of crushed flowers and spilled champagne. The sheriff's tone was calm, procedural, but every word carried weight. "This incident will be formally investigated," he said, glancing between the witnesses and Brooklyn. "We have sufficient grounds for charges of theft and endangerment of an elderly person's life." His words settled over the crowd like a gavel strike, quiet, final, and absolute. Brooklyn stood motionless for a second, as if the air had turned solid around her. Then one of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, you'll need to step away from the property while we conclude the report." His voice was professional, but there was no mistaking the undertone. She wasn't a guest anymore. She was the accused. She looked around, searching for someone to defend her, but no one moved. Even the neighbors' people, who had once complimented her charm and style, now stepped aside, forming a silent corridor that split the garden in two. She walked through it slowly, shoulders stiff, face pale, the sound of her heels echoing against the stone path. No one said a word yet. The silence itself was louder than any insult. It was the kind of punishment that doesn't come from the law, but from conscience, a public judgment, unspoken but inescapable. For the first time, Brooklyn had no mask to wear. Her designer dress was stained with frosting, and tears, her hands trembling as she wiped her face, smearing the remnants of makeup that once made her look perfect. By the time she reached the gate, she no longer looked like the polished nurse or the picture-perfect wife, only a woman stripped of pretense, walking away from the life she had tried so hard to control. When the last police car drove off, the garden fell into stillness again. The balloons were half deflated. The cake ruined, the flowers crushed beneath careless footsteps. And in the middle of it all, I sat surrounded by the wreckage of a day that had begun in innocence and ended in revelation. Gavin approached quietly, still in his lab coat, eyes red and tired. He stopped beside me, then slowly knelt down, his voice shaking. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm sorry. You were right about her. I was blind for too long." I looked at him, my son broken, but finally awake, and felt no triumph, only a quiet peace. I reached out, touching his hand gently. "No one stays blind forever, my dear," I said softly. "What matters is that today you finally see. The wind moved through the garden again, carrying away the last traces of chaos. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang from the nearby church. It was quiet, dignified like justice itself. Within 48 hours, the entire town of Lakeview knew her name. The video, a minute and 20 seconds long, spread faster than wildfire. It started on a neighbor's Facebook post, then appeared on local forums, then on the Lakeview Gazette's front page under the headline, "Nurse accused of pushing her mother-in-law into pond investigation opens into theft and elder abuse." I watched it only once. There was Brooklyn, frozen in motion, the elegant woman everyone once praised, now captured, sneaking into my house, then standing at the pond, pretending to panic. The comments below were relentless. "I can't believe she worked at the hospital. How could anyone do that to an old lady in Lakeview, where gossip traveled faster than the mail?" Her reputation collapsed overnight. The next morning, the hospital where she worked released an official statement. Nurse Brooklyn Meyer is suspended pending investigation for serious violation of professional ethics. The message spread across every employee email and bulletin board. Her photo was removed from the Nurse of the Month wall, replaced by a blank space that seemed to speak louder than any words. By noon, even her friends stopped defending her. People who used to greet her warmly at the grocery store now looked away. Her co-workers quietly deleted old photos, and her apartment group chat voted to remove her for the sake of peace. Once, she had thrived on admiration, on being the perfect wife, perfect nurse. Now, all that remained was silence, the kind that follows disgrace. The Lakeview Police Department delivered an official notice that evening. I was at home when Gavin received it on her behalf, his expression blank. The paper stated she was required to appear for questioning in relation to theft of personal property and elder endangerment, a charge that in the United States carries not just legal punishment, but deep moral shame. News anchors began discussing the Lakeview Pond case, calling it a wake-up call for elder abuse awareness. I didn't speak to reporters. I didn't need to. The truth was, speaking loudly enough on its own, through evidence, through consequence, through the quiet turning of every back that once smiled at her. As for me, I watered my flowers that evening. The sun was soft. The air smelled of lavender. I thought of how fragile reputation can be, how the same people who praise you can vanish the moment your mask cracks. Justice, I realize, doesn't always come from courtrooms. Sometimes it blooms naturally, like truth unstoppable, once it takes root. The day Gavin left was colder than it should have been. Autumn had just begun to touch the trees, and the air carried that dry chill that always came before rain. He stood in the living room suitcase by his feet, the sound of his daughter's soft breathing coming from the hallway where she sat clutching her stuffed rabbit. Brooklyn was on the couch, tears streaking down her face. But the house felt empty, not from things missing, but from trust that could never return. "I filed for temporary separation," Gavin said quietly, his voice steady but exhausted. "It's not revenge, Brooklyn. It's to protect our daughter from this." He gestured vaguely around the room, the shattered peace, the headlines, the whispers that now followed their name everywhere. Brooklyn shook her head violently. "You can't take her away from me. I'm her mother," she cried. "Please, Gavin. They're twisting everything. I made a mistake, but I can fix it." He looked at her for a long time, the woman he had once thought kind, patient, good. "I used to believe you were," he said finally. "But a mother who uses her child to hide her crime has no place in this family." His words were quiet, almost too calm, but they carried the finality of a verdict. Brooklyn collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands, but he didn't move toward her. He just turned and walked to the doorway where his little girl was waiting. He crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Ready to go, sweetheart," he whispered. The child nodded, sleepy-eyed, but trusting, clutching his hand as they stepped outside. The night air was crisp, the sky faintly glowing under the streetlights. Gavin had already hired a lawyer, Mr. Carter, a family attorney, who specialized in child custody. He had gathered everything: the video footage, the witness testimonies, even the hospital's disciplinary notice. The evidence was overwhelming. Every document, every photograph told the same story, not just of a crime, but of a home broken by deceit. When he reached the car, he paused for a moment, glancing back through the open gate. His mother stood on the porch, wrapped in her familiar lavender shawl. Her expression was calm, but her eyes glistened. As he lifted his daughter into the car seat, the little girl spotted her grandmother and waved, smiling faintly. Zoe waved back, her heart heavy yet grateful. The headlights reflected in Gavin's eyes as he shut the door. He didn't look back at the house again. Some goodbyes he knew didn't need words. They were written in silence, sealed by truth. The morning light poured through the glass windows of Flower Studio like a gentle promise. After months of silence, the shop was alive again. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in the golden rays, while the faint melody of jazz filled the room, the same playlist I used to play when the world still felt kind. The scent of lavender and fresh lilies blended softly, wrapping around the space like an embrace of peace long delayed. My granddaughter hummed as she wiped the counter with her tiny hands. Her laughter echoed through the shop, pure, bright, and healing in ways medicine never could be. "Nana," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Can we sell flowers again tomorrow?" I looked at her and smiled. "Of course," I said. "But this time you'll be the main florist." She clapped her hands in delight, her giggle rising like the chime of wind bells by the door. We worked side by side, arranging bouquets, dusting shelves, and polishing the glass display that once held my best creations. It felt like breathing again after a long, painful silence. The scars of betrayal hadn't vanished, but they no longer defined me. Each petal, each ribbon felt like a step back toward life, fragile but free. By noon, neighbors began to drop by, drawn by the open door and the familiar scent of flowers. Mrs. Lang from next door brought a basket of warm muffins, her eyes kind but glistening. "Zoe," she said softly, "we're so glad you're safe. Evil never wins against goodness." I smiled, touched more deeply than words could express. "Thank you," I said. "It's time I start giving back." That afternoon, I filled out an online form for a state volunteer program called Protecting Elders from Financial Abuse. It was based in Columbus, Ohio, the very city where my son had once studied medicine. When they accepted my application, I felt a quiet pride, not the pride of victory, but of purpose. My story wouldn't just end with survival. It would continue in service. Now, every Tuesday, I would attend training sessions, sharing what I had learned: how to recognize signs of manipulation, how to protect assets, how to speak up before it's too late. My pain had become my weapon, my knowledge, my light. And each evening when I closed the shop, the lavender scent lingered, not as a memory of what was lost, but as a symbol of what was found: dignity, peace, and the courage to begin again. Brooklyn's new apartment was small, dim, and smelled faintly of damp concrete and cheap detergent. The walls were thin, the kind where you could hear the neighbor's television through the night, and the flickering neon sign outside her window painted everything in restless shades of blue and pink. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed, her reflection in the cracked mirror across the room almost unrecognizable. Her once perfect hair hung in dull, uneven strands, her skin pale and tired. She looked 10 years older than she had been a month ago. The world she had built, the polished image, the admiration, the careful smiles, had all crumbled. Online, her name had become poison. Each time she opened her phone, the headlines waited like vultures. Nurse accused of pushing mother-in-law into pond, the perfect wife with a dark secret. The comment sections were even crueler. Karma is real. She deserves everything coming to her. How could a nurse do that to anyone, let alone family? Each word cut deeper than any knife. The woman who once cared so much about how people saw her could no longer bear to look at herself. Her trembling hands reached for the tablet lying on the nightstand. She pressed play. The video from that afternoon filled the screen, the birthday decorations, the pond, the chaos. And then, there she was, screaming unhinged, knocking over the table of flowers she had once arranged with pride. The camera caught everything: the wild eyes, the shaking voice, the moment she lost control. She paused the video, unable to watch more. For a long moment, she stared at her own reflection in the darkened screen. Then her gaze drifted to the mirror on the wall. What stared back was not Brooklyn Meyer, the nurse, the wife, the picture of grace. It was a hollow-eyed stranger, haunted and stripped of all excuses. Her lips trembled as she whispered, barely audible, "If that day I had chosen to love instead of demand." Her voice cracked, swallowed by silence. Maybe everything would have been different. But regret has no mercy. The world outside went on, cars passing, people laughing, the city breathing, all while she sat frozen, trapped in a moment she could never undo. The flickering light from the neon sign blinked across her face, illuminating the faint shimmer of tears that refused to fall. For the first time, Brooklyn saw herself without illusion, not as the victim she had tried to be, but as the cause of her own ruin. And in that quiet, unforgiving room, her punishment had already begun. The air by the pond was still that morning, calm, in a way that only comes after a storm. I sat at my writing desk with a cup of chamomile tea and opened my old leather-bound journal. The pages smelled faintly of lavender and ink. My handwriting had grown slower over the years, but the words flowed easily today. "Old age is not weakness," I wrote. "When people reveal who they truly are, the water will always reflect it back." I paused for a moment, watching the sunlight ripple across the pond outside my window. The same pond that had almost taken my life, now quiet, almost kind. I had learned something in these months since everything fell apart. Anger grows like weeds, but forgiveness is like sunlight. It doesn't erase the scars, but it lets them heal. When Gavin came by last night, his eyes full of regret, I told him softly, "Talk to your wife again. Everyone has the right to change. But remember, trust must be earned, not assumed." He nodded, tears shining in his eyes. I saw the boy he used to be, the one who believed kindness could fix anything. Later that afternoon, I took my granddaughter to the pond. The garden was blooming again, golden and white, as if life itself had decided to start over. We carried baskets of flowers, sunflowers, lilies, and a few sprigs of lavender. The little one giggled as she tossed them onto the water, watching the petals drift away. "They look like little boats, Nana," she said. I smiled and replied, "Yes, they carry wishes and maybe a few lessons too." We sat by the water's edge for a long time. The reflection of the flowers shimmered on the surface, peaceful and alive. I realized that revenge had never been my victory, survival had. Not the loud kind, but the quiet endurance that outlasts lies and cruelty. The world had already given Brooklyn her karma. I didn't need to. As the sun began to set, I whispered the words that had stayed in my heart since that day. Karma doesn't need my hand. I only need to keep my heart clean. The wind stirred gently, and the flowers on the water swirled together like a soft promise. If you've ever seen an elder mistreated or silenced, tell their story. Don't look away. Because the truth, no matter how long it sleeps beneath the surface, will always rise to light.